Join our Patreon.
Do you really want to know? We are Mythvision.
Dr. Price, I've been talking briefly from time to time about a group called Israel Only. It is the paradigm that they carry is the idea that salvation, in its terms throughout the Bible, all the way throughout from Genesis to Revelation, it pertains to the descendants of Abraham biologically, ultimately. There are some people that are part of this group that do believe outsiders could join, but they were never really Israelites. They never became Israelites. It's a genetic, it's a bloodline, it's a tribal thing, and that no one outside of that is ever welcome. They take this and use that continuity into the New Testament, and they believe that Jesus came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I'll spare you the details of going into how they think there are two separate diasporas that are going on, Israel and Judea, or Jews. So they say Jews is defined in a certain terms from people who are from the southern tribes, Benjamin and Judea, or the Judah, and then you have the northern tribes, the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And they believe that this is the narrative of the New Testament is about redeeming only the lost sheep of the house of Israel per Matthew. They harmonize often, and they utilize that throughout the entire New Testament. They go to Paul, and they say, Paul...
Excuse me.
It's all right. They say Paul's Gentiles are the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They'll go to Romans 11. They think the fullness of the Gentiles is inclusive of the lost tribes, and that when the fullness comes in, all Israel shall be saved. I just wanted to kind of give... You've heard this before, but for our audience who's hearing me about to ask this question, because one of the things they say, why would Paul go to pagans when they didn't need salvation? Right? Now this is inferring that this is not mystery school language that might have a Hellenistic and a synchronistic concepts utilized in the Greco-Roman world. They take it and try to Judaize it. They try to strictly stick it to the context of the milieu of the Jewish ideas. Now Galatians chapter 4, the question is in here. I know this is a long beginning, but this is important building up the case. Paul is writing, or whoever's writing in the name of Paul. What I am saying is that as long as an heir is underage, he is no different from a slave. Although he owns the whole estate, the heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also when we were underage, when we were in slavery under the elemental forces, spiritual forces of the world, archons, the age, etc. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship, because you are his sons. God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child, and since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. That's the end of verse 7. Not needing to go any further, even though you can find these kind of implications throughout Paul's letters, where it sounds like he's saying he's here to redeem those under the law. Well, who was the law given to other than Israel? And they'll infer that Israel is the 12 tribes. And they'll say, listen, why did Jesus come, according to Paul in Galatians 4, to redeem those under the law? And here he says that we might receive adoption to sonship. Now they believe this is Israelites that Paul is speaking to here, to try and save the Galatian church by saying, hey, here's the message of salvation. He came for those under the law. What would you say to someone who's saying, isn't it obvious, Dr. Bob, that those under the law had to be the biological descendants of Abraham, that this was given to people at Moses, etc., at Sinai? You get the inference here on why they think this is a biological Israelite-only concept that Paul's trying to save them?
Well, yeah, but then why in the same letter does he say that circumcision doesn't make any difference? That he's trying to say that, in fact, if you are one of his target audience and you submit to circumcision, you're cutting yourself off from Christ. It seems a very strange thing to say if you're trying to bring them back to the Jewish faith. I just don't see, like, the under the law business. He seems to be trying to say that those who were under the tutelage of the law don't need to bother with it anymore, and that because now we've reached freedom in Christ, and therefore if you're in Christ, you don't need to get circumcised, and you're in big trouble if you do, because that implies faith in Christ is not enough, and that he had this big blowout with Cephas over that very issue. He says, why are you insisting that the Gentiles Judaize? That's actually the translation. It doesn't just say live like Jews, though that is implied, but why are you Judaizing the Gentiles? And you know how in Acts 21, I guess it is, when Paul comes back to Jerusalem and James and the others say, there's this nasty rumor going around that you tell Jews not to teach their kids to observe the Torah. Well, we'd like to quash that rumor. So why don't you undergo this purification rite and pay for these other guys to do the same? If that is talking about whitewashing, that appears to be another case of Luke's harmonizing, trying to make it look like there was not this strife between law-free and law-observant Christians, which pretty much corresponded to Gentile converts versus Jesus-believing Jews. I mean, not completely, because the purpose of Galatians is to get these Galatian converts not to Judaize, that the men from James are telling them that they, if they want to be real followers of Jesus, they got to be circumcised as he was. And so he's saying no, but his argument also implies that even Jews who believe in Jesus need not be circumcised. He never actually says that, but to me this argument implies it. And the mention of that belief in Acts 21 implies that it just sounds to me like another one of these things where Luke, for instance, with John the Baptist, he takes a cue saying, one is coming after me who's greater, and I'm not worthy to tie his shoes. And Luke makes that an answer to the suspicions of the people. So men were wondering in their hearts whether John were the Christ, but he said, oh no, not me. Well, in Mark, it's not an answer to that question, but he makes it that because he knows there in his day there are John the Baptist sectarians that believed that John was the Christ. And this sounds like another one of those to me. I mean, you can't prove it, but I just don't see why. Plus, he goes back and forth in Romans, where he says, now I'm speaking to those who know the law. But there are passages in Romans that are aimed at Gentiles who don't. And he says to the Jewish law-observant Christians, don't give these people any trouble. One says, I am keeping the holy days to honor God, and the other says, I'm not keeping them purposely to honor God because he's freed us from the law. And he says, look, both are serving God in their own way. Let them do it. Don't be a stickler. The servant has to live up to his master's demands, and you can trust him to do it. Don't you start ruling on this. I just don't see this whole background framework that in fact, when they get to use, when the Israel only gang says that the so-called Gentiles are really Jews,
or Israelites, right?
The everything is thrown up for grabs. Well, what does Gentile mean? Was there a way to differentiate Arabs, Greeks, Romans from people of Jewish or Israelite descent? I mean, if Gentile is to be taken as referring to the lost sheep of Israel, I don't think anything makes any sense anymore. You're just sort of saying, well, I'm tagging this group this way and that group that way because it would sure work out interestingly in my system. And it just seems to me that's a strange way of interpreting the Bible. It lacks the central key that you are supplying to it, and so I have to think it's us reading it in.
Right, and I think just going to Galatians 4 again in the context of him saying those of us, he says, but when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might have or might receive adoption as sonship. To me, that's interesting, because if this is implying here that Jew first, then the Gentile concept, let's just say, for whatever reason, here it seems first to the 12, then beyond, that would make sense to me if to those, or to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption as sonship. I wonder if the idea is here he came for Israel, or came for his people first, and then we are now able to receive adoption as sons. This idea that, hey, you guys now can be adopted in. He came for his people first. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. That could play a part in this scenario. But the idea is, what does he need saving them from? You know, if they're not under the law, what do they need to be redeemed from? And Israel-only proponents will suggest the only people who needed redemption were those who were under the curse of the law. And they think that non-Israelites were never under the curse of the law. They'll go to Genesis chapter 12, for example, and they'll reference stuff like the cursings, bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. To me, I think that immediately in the context, you start seeing that with Egypt, you know, in Exodus, where the Pharaoh was good with Joseph, everything was great, they were blessed. Then there was a Pharaoh who did not remember their father Joseph, and you know what happens then, the slaughter of the innocents and all that. And then Egypt ends up getting curses. And the curses are sent as plagues. And the plagues end up defeating the gods of Egypt, etc. So I think that other nations do play a role, but I think that they have in my opinion, there's a vacuumous system here where they're suggesting that through you, the descendants of Abraham, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. They think these nations are the 12 tribes.
Yeah, that just seems to me completely arbitrary. Let's say, well, it only refers to Samoans, and so Paul was trying to raise money, and when he says he needs it to go to Rome and then to Spain, he really means to go to New Guinea. I mean, you could just make it say anything you want. I just don't see the compelling link with the diaspora Jews. He's depicted in Acts, at least, as trying to preach to diaspora Jews in their synagogues, but some scholars doubt that that's even true, that's narratizing the theology that you find in Romans 9 through 11, where it says that, okay, Jews have rejected it, but that's only temporary, and in fact God made them, he manipulated them into not believing it, kind of like in Mark 4, why tell the parables to keep everybody in the dark? And then don't worry though, this gives the opportunity for us to preach to the Gentiles and to rake in a bunch of converts there, and once the Jews see that, they'll say, hey, maybe there's more to this than we thought. We ought to give this a second look and get on the bandwagon. And he says, so everybody will ultimately be saved, or at least the whole range of humanity, if not every individual. And it sounds to me kind of like that Acts is portraying that as if Paul himself went to Jews and then to Gentiles, because there's three times in Acts where it says, okay, I'm washing my hands of you stubborn stiff necks, and going to the Gentiles. Do you get any impression that that happened reading the epistles? He's the apostle to the Gentiles. And if you say, oh, well, that means Jews, well, then anything means anything.
Well, they'll try and say straw man. Because they'll go, you're saying Jews again instead of Israelites.
Either way.
Two separate. They think there's a separate diaspora here of uncircumcised Israelites, and that's Paul's ministry, whereas Jews are recognizably circumcised outside of Judea would be the diaspora of the Jews. So they go back and they try to say there's two separate. But I wanted to mention something about Acts 17 while we're in the vein of this conversation on video. Acts 17, Paul goes, he's trying to... he's on his ministry with Silas here. It's no longer Barnabas. And there are others with him. And it says that he goes, I can't remember the name, but Thessalonica, I think, or something. And he's reasoning first, it says, whoever wrote Acts in 17 says, he goes to the Jews as it was custom in the synagogue to preach for 3 Sabbaths. He reasons with them from the scriptures. But at this place, they're a little bit hard-headed, but hey, some of the Jews listened, and it says some of the Greek and noble people and the women followed Paul, but then they rallied up people from the marketplace. They came, the mobs came, ran them off. Him and Silas and the guys had to run off to the next place. And once again, he first goes to the synagogue with the Jews. He reasons with them again, and Greeks again all of a sudden. Well, who are these? They're actually Israelites.
How would he know?
There's presuppositions, because nobody needs salvation, and nobody's needing to listen to this message unless you were under the law and needed salvation, which meant you had to be an Israelite. Anyway, I digress, but here's where it gets interesting. The last place he goes is this place, Athens. He ends up in Athens. Holy moly, if you know where Athens is, and the Areopolis, okay, he ends up preaching at the synagogue first, waiting for Silas, I forget. Maybe he didn't do that here. But he ends up in a place without Silas, and he sends for them. And then it says a spirit stirs up in his heart, and he says, you know what, I gotta go talk. I gotta give the gospel to someone. So he goes to the marketplace, and there are Epicureans and Stoic philosophers. And he's conversing with these people, and they go, what's this rambling babbler have to say? And sure enough, he's like, okay, at the Areopolis, he gets his fair chance. You go ahead, you talk. All right. I would notice you're all very religious, and I saw that you had one to the unknown God, a statue or stone written to the unknown God that you don't realize you're worshiping is the God I'm about to tell you. And he tells them, from one man, all the nations of the earth, 12 tribes. And I'm just pausing to kind of give you the implication here. From one man, all the nations of the earth, nations, 12 tribes, of the earth land. And they go into these implications, knowing their appointed times, etc., etc. So somewhere here, when it talks about these people get convinced of his message and some don't like it and some do, well, the ones who follow must be Israelites, according to this narrative. That's the kind of position that Epicurean and Stoic philosophers that were convinced. Your poets, Paul says, your own poets say, well, if they followed the message, they were probably Israelites. Paul was not really presenting a message to any and every pagan. He wasn't really saying, all men. He wasn't really saying, hey, all you guys. No, it can't be. They can't allow it, because they have already other ideas that make it to the point where not everyone needed this message. Which is why I think mystery school concepts are important in recognizing this movement of early Christianity, because if mystery school, and I just did a video with Derek Bennett, that'll be released sometime soon, they had soteriological concepts very similar to Paul. And if Paul's teaching a soteriology, or a salvation, I'm putting in quotations, to an audience that's called Gentiles, whatever that may be, and it looks a lot like other non-Israelite movement teachings of salvation and soteriology in this mystery school movement, then what do? Do you keep it strictly in the Jewish milieu, or do you recognize Paul might be doing something else?
Was Epimenides an Israelite? I mean, he's the one he's quoting there about the unknown.
No. They won't. They'll say, here's a straw man. No, we believe that these pagan Israelites got lost out into the nations, adopted the pagan ways, became uncircumcised, forgot their forefathers, forgot everything. And Paul's trying to redeem them back. That's the whole concept. And then they run to Revelation 5, 7, 14, these chapters, the 144,000. And they think that that's actually Paul's mission too, is to collect in the 12 tribes. His mission is to the uncircumcised, but the uncircumcised are the lost Israelites. It's a very... I need a book. I need a book, because at least then you can honestly say, okay, here's where I find issues, and give a critical response to the idea that we have. And I would love to have it, because I know that you would entertain it and at least read it and give your critical response. And then maybe you'll drop the subject, but at least I will know that I can get scholars to really respond to this position, and they can define their terms in the way they perceive it. But their point is, who needed salvation? What's the narrative all about in the Old Testament? Israel. Salvation of Israel. Salvation through Israel. Blessings through Israel. Curses through Israel. And the salvation of Israel itself, especially when God finally starts cracking Israel apart for their worship of idols and all these things. So his promise, they're trying to say, in the New Testament, is being fulfilled to his people. And they'll take passages like, only the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And they broad stroke it into Pauline literature as well. So it's interesting. Not buying it, but it's interesting, and it's something I would love to have you really wrap your head around if we could get something written on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you got to write that book.
I'm going to have to if no one else does, at least. But I'm going to need help from some of these guys so I don't end up looking like I'm trying to strawman them, because I think it's best if someone who believes in this theory writes it, because they're going to be the strongest ones trying to defend it. I'm not going to have... let me try and defend this position for you. No. So, anyway, last word on that. Those under the law, do you think this is the Jews that he redeemed them first, that Paul's referencing, and that way adoption as sons can come to others? Or what do you think's here in Galatians 4 going on? Do you want me to read that again? Or?
Well, I just think that he's... the argument about the pedagogy or whatever... that was the law, explains why mankind has reached a level of maturity where it is no longer necessary, and that because Christ and faith in Christ are enough for salvation. I mean, in the Old Testament, they didn't even have any idea of post-mortem salvation. Salvation didn't mean that. It just meant a good life and a blessed one if you kept the Torah. But it's hard for me to see this as consistent with saying, well, did Paul, in their view, think that any reclaimed Israelites or Jews would then keep the Torah?
That's a great question I asked. I said, why doesn't he tell them to observe? I mean, if they are Israelites, wouldn't you give them their laws and say, hey, you guys can definitely worship and follow? You know, I asked that question, and it's not really well spelt out. I think the way they look at Paul is eschatological predominantly, so whatever his eschatology is outweighs all the other stuff, and therefore, if Paul knows the end is about to happen, well, why are you going to get him to get in all these ceremonies and practices? The end's about to happen. And the end also includes the end of the law. Because, all that has to come. However, it's my opinion that Paul doesn't think the end of the law is fully here yet. It's fading away maybe, if you take Hebrews and kind of want to harmonize that. What has began to fade away is almost out of the way. And I think he's talking about the law there. But it's not completely gone, so why didn't he come to Israelites and say, hey, observe this thing? Sabbath observance, dietary laws, hint, strangled animals, all that good stuff, and then circumcision. And there's not a really good explanation that I've heard, but it's an eschatological one usually that I hear. Is, hey, don't worry about it because it's about to end.
Well, in the only place where I think the end coming soon is mentioned in relation to the law is in 1 Corinthians 7, where it says that in view of the crisis of the moment, stay the way you are. If you're not circumcised, don't get circumcised. Or if you're a Jew who has had the epispasm operation, restoring a foreskin basically, to hide the marks of circumcision because you want to be an assimilated Hellenist, don't bother undoing it. And that kind of sounds like he's saying these distinctions are not important. In Colossians, it flat out says, because the law was just a shadow, like a charade of the things that, the good things to come, which have come. Don't let anybody tell you got to observe holy days, dietary laws, and so on. But if he's trying to get Israelites and Jews to snap out of their paganism, what's that going to mean? I guess a choice of gods, that it's Christ and no other gods. Mm-hmm. But it just seems to me odd that he would, like, what is the point if it's not really, if they're not returning to their Jewish heritage? He seems to be saying that Gentiles can be adopted into Israel. 1 Peter says the same sort of thing. In Ephesians, there's no more wall, no more barrier between those considered the people of God and those who were told, you're not my people, because now you are. Wouldn't they always have been?
That's a great point, because they will go into the prophets and show how God divorced Israel, the northern tribes. And he cuts them off. You are not my people. And they'll reference that. Say, see, you are not my people. Now he's restoring them in Ephesians. This is the kind of rhetoric. And to me, it's interesting because I go further back. They kind of say that the Genesis narrative is kind of allegorical of the history of Israel. And they think that it's pretty much, you might as well start at the Mosaic Law, is where it kind of, the Genesis narrative really, it starts at Moses. Whereas I go prior and I say, well, there's a very likely narrative here of the dispersion and why there are all these nations that have been scattered with Elohim in control. And I think Paul might be trying to rectify them to his perception, which is the true God. And I don't know if that's the high God or if he's equated the high God, the Platonic high God, and combined him with his Yahweh God, if that is the case, or if it's not and they're divorced. Doesn't matter. The bottom line is, I think he's trying to redeem the nations from their stronghold of these Elohim, the same way Elijah's fighting Baal, etc., etc., except Elijah's fighting Baal from other Israelites from worshiping Baal. Elijah's not going to other people in Canaan and saying, hey, you need to turn from Baal. But Paul, they'll say, is doing the same thing Elijah's doing to Israelites who've become pagans. And he's saying, come back. Whereas we're saying it's more universal. He's actually trying to rectify the nations that are controlled by the Elohim. Not the 12 tribes necessarily, but bigger. And to those who broad stroking with Israel. So if you brush shoulders with Israel, in my opinion, you're going to either be blessed or cursed in some way. The same way that Muslims might say, we've come to America now, Sharia law must eventually take over because we have supplanted our feet like Joshua. Everywhere my feet go, that kind of concept. So I think that the Israelites also did that. When they brushed with other nations, get ready, you're going to fall into their story in some way. And it's all about Israel. But we'll leave it at that because there's so much more that can be said, and it can rabbit trail into other conversations, and there can be responses and arguments made and such. But we need a book. We really need a book.
Well, the whole thing seems to me to come down to the fact that the key thing in their system is something that it never says. They're saying, well, if he's talking about the diaspora or diasporas, and Paul means this, then things appear in a new light. Well, yeah, they would, but is there any reason to think that's what he means? And
Join our Patreon